Covered in this section, we're going to completely destroy the environment. First thing we're going to do is disable textured solid so that I can get a regular shaded mode. I don't need to see those checker patterns because we're just going to be dealing with meshes now. Now what I'm going to do here is, since we're going to be modifying these meshes, I want to smooth any angles we might create by warping these pieces of wood. So I'm manually splitting some of the edges apart so that I can press set smooth for the entire object to smooth small angles. Now what I showed you in the introduction video is how to use the edge split modifier. That's what you should be using here as well. It basically does the same thing, but it automates it. And it also is compatible with the game engine. This is actually one thing I wish I would have known a little bit earlier, but I didn't find out about until maybe 3/4 of the way through the project, that the edge split modifier actually does work in the game engine. And so what I'm doing here is basically splitting all the edges manually so that I can smooth these objects, so that when we warp them, the small angles on them will be smoothed, but not the 90-degree angles. But you can just go ahead and select all these objects and add an edge split modifier. Now with these objects selected, I'm going to go up into the Object menu. I'm going to scroll down to Make Single User. I'm going to select Object and ObData, and then Selected Objects. That makes this group of meshes their own individual meshes, which allows us to modify them without modifying all the other link duplicates, because now they're no longer link duplicates. I join these meshes together, and now we're going to edit this as one system. So now I'm just going to bring that pillar down as if it sunk into the ground a little bit. I'm going to modify all the support planks around it to kind of accommodate that kind of sunkenness. And that's essentially what we're going to be doing this entire chapter, is just warping things as would naturally happen over time, especially with a dirt foundation. And if you hold the K key and you left click and drag, you can use the knife tool, and it will cut vertices or extra loops in whatever object you slice across. That's how I just added those few loops of vertices there. I'm going to add some to the pillars too. So I make a couple of bends and warps here and there. Make sure to check everything out at all angles, and make sure there's no intersections. Be careful about that. That's why I'm working with basically one small group of objects at a time. Then I'm going to make them a single user as well, and I'm going to join them all together. I'm going to go through an angled view, and I made all those knife cuts. And in front view, I'm just modifying them all to make them appear to be unique objects, giving them different warps and distortions. I'm working with just one group of planks at a time. Now a few cuts in the pillars. I'm going to do the same thing as with the middle supports and pillars. Just making different warps and distortions. And you want to make sure you don't modify things too extremely, because you want these distortions to be realistic. And I think even what I'm doing now is a bit too extreme. I'm going to go through it later and kind of make the bends and warps more mellow. But it's kind of hard to get an idea of how realistic something looks until you're finished all the modifying. and then you can see it in the entire environment finished, and then go through and make a few tweaks here and there. In front view, I'm even moving pillars a little bit to the side of each other, so it's not a perfectly straight line. And where each of the planks meet, I'm moving those vertices away from each other just a little bit so it doesn't look so neat. Just an extra little detail. Now that I made more modifications, I'm going back to the original middle supports and making sure that those planks line up correctly with the supports that I just modified. And now I'm going to do the right side of pillars. I'm going to make them all single users and then join them together so they're one mesh, and repeat the process we did before. There was no real rhyme or reason to all these cuts. I'm just putting the cuts in the center of the cross planks and one or two cuts in the pillars. Those single planks there that stick out from the pillars, I'm making sure not to select the vertices on the very end of them, because that's where they connect to the trusses on the roof. So I want to make sure they don't move so that I don't have to end up repositioning them. I know I definitely made the distortions a little bit too extreme on this side. I go through later and mellow them out. Now, same story with the planks and the pillars along the wall. We're going to make them single users, object and object data. We're going to join them together, cut a bunch of new edge loops in them, and then modify. Sidewalls are going to be a bit simpler because we don't have to worry too much about intersections and aligning them with other objects in the scene. Just got to make sure they don't go through the walls in the back. Now we're done with the side walls, at least with the pillars and the planks. We're going to work with the back walls now. Same story. I'm going to join all the pillars and the planks together along the wall, make them single users, cut a bunch of loop cuts in them, and modify the hell out of them. Don't be afraid to delete a plank here and there. That can add extra detail. In an environment this old, it's bound to be missing a piece or two of its infrastructure. That's what I did on one of the sidewalls. In case you missed that, I deleted one of the planks just to create a gap in the supports. Just create a little bit of extra detail and a little bit of uniqueness to that one wall. And the bottom floorboards there, I'm not modifying them too much. There's not a whole lot I can do with them. So I just made a couple bends here and there. And these pillars are against the wall, or at least real close to the wall. And they're sandwiched in between two groups of planks, so I'm not going to modify them too much. I'm just going to change their shape a little bit by rotating those circles of vertices a little bit to make it thinner in the middle, and by maybe moving it left or right a little tiny bit. Now we're done with them. We're going to work on the planks around the doorway now. Now moving on to the trusses. Same story, but since there's a lot of trusses, I'm just going to work with a few at a time. And now I'm just splitting the edges manually so I can set smooth it. Remember to use the edge split modifier. So I'm going to select 4 at a time. I'm going to make them single users. Actually, at first I'm going to select all of them and make them single users. And then I'm going to select about 4 or 5 at a time, join them together in one mesh, and edit them. You don't want to work with too many objects at once. Because like I said, you got to be really careful of intersections. Now that I'm finishing up editing the trusses, I'm going to go through and make sure that those supports sticking out of the back of the middle pillars are aligned correctly with the new truss modifications. I'm also making sure that the trusses align with the cross support or the cross plank modifications. Since I brought some of them down as if they've sunk a bit, I've now got to bring the trusses down to at least meet them halfway. They don't have to be lying on them flush. The trusses can be suspended in the air. They don't have to be lying on those cross planks. But I'm just bringing them a little bit down so that there's not so big of a gap. I'm going to put a few cuts in the main beam at the very top of the ceiling. I'm just going to modify that ever so slightly. I'm going to set smooth that object as well. Now we're going to work with the roof slats. I put a bunch of cuts in it to start off with, and I make a bunch of modifications. However, I end up undoing those and just making simpler ones. These don't have to be, I mean, these are noticeable and they do add a lot of extra detail to the roof, especially when we add AO maps and shadow maps. But in terms of modifying the mesh, we don't really have to be that extreme with it, and we shouldn't be, because there shouldn't be a whole lot of distortion with these roof slats. And if you distort them too much, you encounter a lot of intersection problems with the trusses and with the roof, and so it's best to just keep the modifications simple on these. Like right now I'm making them a bit wavy. Later on I just move them up and down. Now I'm undoing all those steps that I just did. I'm going to undo it in object mode too so that I can get back to the original mesh. And now we're going to restart that. So we're going to start with the slats that go long ways. I'm just considering which way to modify them. In a slightly skewed view from the front, I'm just going to move them up the trusses a tiny bit by selecting a few groups of vertices and then just moving them up slightly diagonally. Just a little bit, just to give them some waviness. It might be imperceptible, but subconsciously people will pick up on it, and if you don't add just slight variations like that, people will pick up on it definitely. They'll say that these things, they look way too straight to be in this kind of environment. So just creating small variations like that in every object in your environment just adds a little bit more detail and a little bit more realism. And all that is obvious, I know, but it's also a common mistake to allow some objects in your environment to appear to be extremely pristine and unmodified, unchanged. The textures might be too clean, the mesh might be too clean. Either way, if you're creating a dilapidated environment, every single object in it, I mean, unless it's supposed to be a brand new object, every single object in it has to be modified in some way that makes it appear old or dirty or like it's been there a while. There was a little error along the wall there that I just spotted. I wasn't paying attention to the intersections when I modified those planks. But I do multiple sweeps all throughout the project in every corner of the environment to make sure that there's no intersections. Now we're going to work with the sheets of metal. We're going to work with them one by one. I'm not going to join all those together. because a lot of them are overlapping and it would be way too difficult to add loop cuts to and modify. So we're just going to work one by one. I normally just add a loop of vertices in the middle with the knife tool. I rotate them, I pull them out a little bit just to bend the sheet of metal. And on occasion I'll put a slice in the corner just so I can tear the corner up and make it look like it's being folded or being peeled. These are sheets of metal, so we don't want to modify them as if they were cloth or something like that. We want to keep modifications to a minimum, but allow a lot of bends and detail to be added to them. I'm going to go through and select them all now and make them all single users, but I'm not going to join them together as a single mesh. I'm going to keep them all individual and then modify them one by one. If you press the O key, you can enable proportional vertex editing. That's what I'm using to pull one vertex away from the sheet metal, and it kind of drags the rest of it with it with a fall off radius. That's what that little circle around the mouse cursor is. So it makes it easier to modify these sheets of metal. And often I won't even add a new loop of vertices. I'll just modify the vertices that are already there just by pulling one corner away with proportional vertex editing and making sure that none of the sheets overlap. And there I selected that one edge. I brought it out. And that's another trick to editing these sheets of metal. You can select two opposite vertices or that edge along the center there and just pull it away with proportional vertex editing, and it'll kind of put these bends and folds in the sheet of metal that look realistic. And there I just added a corner, and now I'm going to peel that corner up. That also adds a cool detail to the sheets. But because all these sheets of metal already have quite a few faces on them, I try not to add too many vertices and too much detail to how much I modify them. Because there are a lot of sheets of metal, we're going to be adding more. And we don't want too much detail. I spotted another error in one of the roof slats, so I just fixed that up real quick. That was just because I forgot to select one of the vertices when I was making a modification. Now I'm working with the window frames. I'm not going to change many of these. I'm just going to put a cut in the center of this one, make a little modification, but I end up not changing any of the others, at least not significantly. Now I didn't even bother to make the rest of these single objects, or single users I mean. I just made a simple modification to one of the vertical beams, just to give it a little extra detail. But it's so minor, it's so insignificant, it's barely perceptible, but it's there. In fact, I shouldn't have put it there because it adds a few extra faces that really aren't necessary, because it doesn't add a significant amount of detail at all. Now I'm going to join all the trusses together in one mesh, and we're going to go through in side view and just rotate the ends just a little tiny bit so that they're all not aligned against the wall perfectly straight. Just by selecting the last 4 vertices and rotating them from side view. Now, covered in this section, we're going to make some new plank objects. We're going to create hanging wires, and we're going to fix up the environment a little bit. So on the side here, there's some planks hanging down, 2 to be exact, and 1 plank crossing them. I don't know exactly what the purpose of this is for, but in some of the reference photos that I've included, in one of the warehouse images, you'll see that these are hanging down. I guess to hang rope over or something, I don't know. I think my references were actually from a horse stable or something of that sort. That wouldn't explain why there were tires in there, but that's just an extra detail. So I'm just creating these just for extra detail. They're going to be hanging from the ceiling. And that's basically it. What you see right here is 2 beams hanging down with 1 crossing them. And these are our new plank objects. We're going to throw these down the entire line of the warehouse. We're going to have maybe 8 or 9 of them. We're going to unwrap them. We're going to modify them a little bit. And we're going to place them right up against the trusses just like that. And right there I just transform the origin to geometry so I can rotate it from the center. And now I'm using link duplication, Alt plus D, to move these down the warehouse. And it looks like I made about 5 of them. I don't want these hanging down too low. I don't want them to get in the way of the character actually walking through the environment. This is just an accessory to the roof. It's not going to serve any purpose whatsoever for the actual game. I unwrapped it just like I unwrapped the planks in the beginning. And we're going to align these in the UV layout in the same exact way. Overlapping, but they each have a unique space. And I'm going to make sure that the thin edges, the thin faces on the sides of each of these planks is smaller or thinner in the UV layout than the wide faces. And we're going to bring back the old checker pattern. Or we might not. At this point, I think I was experienced enough with unwrapping planks that I was doing it by eye. There I was just splitting the edges so I could smooth that one plank. We're not going to modify the vertical planks because it's really not necessary to add extra faces there. Now I flip these around to the other side of the environment with link duplication, and I'm going to align these to the trusses. I think I only have about 3 on that side. Now I'm going to select them all, and I join them together so that I can make the modifications I need, just to make them all look a slight bit unique. Now the reason I joined all these together instead of making them single objects first, or single users first, is because these are the only objects I'm working with, so I selected them all. If we were to do that with one of the planks, with a group of planks, and we would have joined them together, since all the other planks we didn't select were link duplicates of each other, then if I joined 10 planks together, every other plank in the scene would have shown 10 planks too. It might be hard to understand with just me describing it verbally, but trust me that if you are in doubt, just make things single users first, unless you're selecting them all. Unless you're selecting every link duplicate. Make them single users first, then join them together. Now we're going to work on the wires. I just added I think a 5 vertex circle, and I extruded it all the way down the cross planks there. And this is on the sidewall. Sidewall is going to have 2 hanging wires. And we're going to add a bunch of loop cuts in this wire so that we can make it look like it's hanging down. And then we're going to add some wires along the center planks, the center pillars. No, I don't use NURBs or paths or anything like that. I just add a bunch of loop cuts and then I move the loops to make the hanging wire look realistic. So I do it manually. And right here, I didn't know what I was doing at first, so I just put a bunch of cuts in it because I didn't know how I wanted the wire to hang. So I figured I'll just add a bunch of cuts. I'll move some of the vertices down, see how it looks, and if it sucks, we'll restart. And that's what I end up doing. And then I end up using a much more organized technique for making these wires hang down. Since the wire is going to be all one color, it's not even really going to be a texture. We didn't have to unwrap it before we started modifying it. So that's why I'm just going through now and modifying it, not even worrying about the UVs, because they're all going to basically be the same. I think I just end up adding a material to this and not even a texture with a black color. It's too thin to waste texture space on, and it's too thin to waste adding a texture to and eating up those resources. Any amount of detail you might put on a wire is not really going to be perceptible unless it's a really, really thick wire, or unless it's something like a rope, which has those notches in it from all the braiding. Then it might be worth adding at least a normal map to. I duplicated that last loop of vertices, I moved it up, and now I created a new wire. And I'm using the same technique now because I thought that wire below it looked okay at the time. I end up making it look better. I end up pretty much fixating on these wires, which is a stupid thing to do because it's such a small detail. what I end up doing is basically pinning parts of a wire above each pillar and then having it droop down in between the pillars instead of having it be pinned up at random parts along the cross planks. And I should be getting to that very soon. So now I'm looking at the wires in the full environment, and I think this is basically the part where I begin to realize how much it sucks. Yeah, and then I go and delete it. I duplicate the top wire and move it down because that one looked a little bit better. I end up deleting all the vertices except one loop, extruding it all the way down again, and I'm going to put a cut above each of the pillars because that's where I'm going to pin the wires, and I'm going to put a bunch of cuts in between all of those cuts because that's where the wires are going to droop down. So this is a much more organized approach, and it ends up with a lot better results. Doesn't look like complete chaos. I put at minimum 3 cuts in between each of the pillars. If the wires are drooping a little bit more, I add a few more cuts, so there can be a few more angles, and I can droop it down further while still making a smooth line. I joined those two wires together and I flipped it over to the other side. Deleted the top wire and then I duplicated the bottom wire up. I'm making a few modifications to it to make it look unique. By the way, the duplication of the wires was link duplication. So the modifications I'm making to the wires on this wall, the same thing is happening to the wires on the opposite wall. I did not make these single users yet. Actually, it looks like I did just as I was explaining that, and now I'm adding some extra detail to each wire on opposing walls to make them unique from each other. That does it for the wires on the side. We're going to create some wires for the middle pillars now. They're basically going to be the same things. I'm going to take one of the 5 vertex circles from that rope, and I duplicated it and moved it over, all because I didn't want to add a new circle. I'm making these a bit more thick. Wasn't sure why. I guess I just wanted the wires in the center to be a little bit more noticeable. I'm going to extrude that all the way down the warehouse. And I'm going to add loop cuts or knife cuts above each of the pillars, just like we did with the sidewall, and cuts in between them so that we can make them droop down, just like we did before. Now there's a lot more to pay attention to when you're working with the wire along these pillars, because there's more supports to worry about, so there's going to be a lot more alignment. It's not that it's a big deal, it's just make sure the wire doesn't intersect any of these planks. So I added a bunch of loop cuts above all of those diagonal planks so that I can bump the wires out up and over them so that they don't intersect. I'm sure there's a much more accurate way to make these wires kind of fall down using pads or NURBS or whatever, but they're certainly not. That's certainly not going to be a faster method. So I don't mind just eyeing these up. So I'm rotating the view and I'm going down the line to make sure none of these wires are intersecting the diagonal planks or any of the pillars or anything. And it's looking good. Don't forget to set smooth all the objects you want to be smoothed. And now I'm going to throw that wire onto the other side. And we're going to modify it to make it look unique. And that was a regular duplication, that wasn't a link duplication, because we're modifying this immediately. And we don't want both sides to be modified. First thing I'm going to do is in top view, make sure that this wire is following the path of all the cross planks. Now these wires at the very ends, they don't do anything except go into the wall. I didn't add any kind of electrical boxes or anything of that sort. But it doesn't look bad, it looks like it just goes into the wall. So there I chose to make the wire look like it wasn't pinned on that one pillar. That something happened and it came off of its hook or something, and now this entire wire is drooping down along this one big section. I'm just making sure everything is consistent with how physics would react to wires falling down like that. I'm fixating. It doesn't have to be perfect. No one's going to go through your environment and scrutinize your super thin wires. And you can see those middle supports there that connect to the middle pillar. I dragged the wire on top of those so they weren't intersecting. I could have gone beneath, but I chose to go over the top. So all those modifications I made, I'm going through now and making them a little bit less extreme. Now that I can see them all together and in the entire environment, I can see what looks right and what looks wrong, and I can go and fix it. So I'm going to give the environment a sweep now, make sure there's no intersections, and make sure that all the modifications look realistic. And here the one wire was intersecting the middle support planks, so I decided to just bring that beneath it, whereas on the other side I made the wire go over it. So I'm just making a simple fallen wire right here.